Mhm. Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topics for tonight are big money, the role of labor in the election, and defending the election. And so let's get to various things here. I see we have some folks who have arrived. No comments yet, however. But I'm going to start off. Well, it's the first of our pieces on big money. I find this one truly stunning. Truly stunning. So this is going to be, this one is stunning. So this is a piece from Open Secrets. The title of it, okay, is Billionaire Timothy Mellon. And there's a picture of him, just below. Has poured $165 million into the elections of 2024. Now, this was as of August 23rd, 2024 at 2:18 p.m. It's already September 7th. He might have poured a few million more in by this time. But $165 million into the 2024 election. The caption under this photo says, aside from his recent multi-million dollar donations, Timothy Mellon is known to maintain a low profile. I thought that was interesting. And of course, accompanying him in the photos are Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump, two of the biggest recipients of his largesse. And beginning the article, Timothy Mellon, did I say the author was Maya Cook? I did now. Timothy Mellon, heir to the Gilded Age industrialist Andrew Mellon, has continued, he must be the grandson or great-grandson of Andrew Mellon, don't you think? Has continued to pour tens of millions into the campaigns of former President Donald Trump, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Republican congressional candidates in 2024. He's pumped over $165 million into the 2024 election, making him the top donor fueling outside spending groups this year. Mellon is known as a, quote, guardian angel donor, a term given to contributors who are political groups' top donor and account for more than 40% of the group's funding. Oh, I'm sorry, this is as of July 2024. He's increased his spending since the 2016 election by 5,000-fold, 5,000 times. In the 2016 election, he provided only $32.4 thousand. Then in 2018, he jumped to $10.1 million. In 2020 to $60.1 million. 2022 to $41.7 million. And in 2024 so far, $165 million. I mean, the guy's on track to end with $250 million worth of contributions to this campaign. In July, he made a $50 million cash infusion to the pro-Trump super PAC, the Make America Great Again. Literally the MAGA super PAC. New Federal Election Commission filings show this brings his total contributions to the group to $125 million this election cycle, including a $50 million check he wrote to the super PAC the day after Trump was convicted of 34 felonies. I guess he likes me some criminal stuff, right? Mellon's latest $50 million contribution accounts for over 90% of what MAGA raised in July. The super PAC ended the month with about $124.5 million cash on hand. Well, I don't know if we're seeing that cash go out right now. Trump doesn't seem to be spending anywhere near what the Democrats are spending right now. But I'm sure that will be flooding the airwaves the last few weeks of the campaign. That's what the super PACs do. Mellon's first major foray into federal elections was during the 2020 cycle when he poured $60 million into federal political committees supporting Republican candidates, including $20 million to pro-Trump super PAC, America First Action. With 2 months to go, he's more than doubled his giving in 2024. This kind of giving was not always the norm for Mellon. He once backed groups with a focus on environmental, women's rights, and Native American rights. So what has made him change? Timothy Mellon is an heir to his grandfather, and that was his grandfather, Andrew Mellon's dynastic fortune, which positioned the Mellons as the 34th richest family in America as of February 2024. I find it interesting that he's only the 34th richest family, but he can afford to give so much money to these campaigns. I mean, it seems to indicate that even if you're a relatively small billionaire, you can still have an outsized effect on elections. Andrew Mellon served as the U.S. Secretary of Treasury from 1921 to 1932 and was known for authoring policies during the Coolidge administration that reduced corporate taxes and increased revenue following World War I. So if he increased revenue, I presume he increased revenue based on taxes on people. Before entering politics, Andrew Mellon commanded a vast industrial empire spanning banking, oil, coal, aluminum, and shipping. Aside from his recent multi-million-dollar donations, Timothy Mellon is known to maintain a low profile. It is impossible to find more than one or two pictures of his face on the internet. Mellon has been criticized for stances taken in his personal autobiography, where he called the U.S. safety net programs a, quote, slavery redux, unquote, responsible for making black people, quote, even more belligerent, unquote. Independent presidential contender Robert F. Kennedy Jr., not such a contender anymore, is he, whose hybrid PAC, American Values 2024, received $25 million from Mellon earlier this year, is quoted on the book's back cover praising Mellon as a, quote, maverick entrepreneur. He certainly is a maverick, all right. Kennedy faced allegations of being a, quote, spoiler, unquote, candidate, who could siphon votes for major party candidates before suspending his campaign on August 23rd and endorsing Trump. Well, I guess we all think he endorsed Trump because he was siphoning off votes by that time, primarily from Trump, because his campaign positions had alienated many progressives who had started off viewing his campaign with a great deal of hope. But of course, he alienated the progressives over time. So by the time he dropped out, the main person he was siphoning votes from was the Donald. Here are the top all-time recipients of Timothy Mellon's political donations. $126.5 million to Make America Great Again. $55 million to the Congressional Leadership Fund, the Republican Congressional PAC. Also, American Values 2024, Kennedy's campaign, $25 million, $3,300. And the Senate Leadership Fund, that's the Republican Senate Fund, $20 million. America First Action, another Trump PAC, $20 million. The Sentinel Action Fund for $11 million. I don't know exactly where they stand. I'm pretty sure they're a Republican group, but I don't know exactly where. Wisconsin Truth PAC, $5 million. American Policy Fund, $4 million. Connecticut Patriots PAC, $2,500,000. Evergreen Principles PAC, $2,200,000. Evergreen Principles PAC sounds like an environmental PAC. The bulk of Mellon's public political donations were made in the last 3 years. The top five are MAGA, Congressional Leadership Fund, the American Values PAC, Senate Leadership Fund, and Sentinel Action Fund, which is aligned with the Heritage Foundation supporting Project 2025. Oh boy. The Congressional Leadership Fund and the Senate Leadership Fund are super PACs aligned with Republican leadership in their respective chambers of Congress and dedicated to electing GOP candidates at Capitol Hill. During the 2022 midterms, the Congressional Leadership Fund spent over $227 million to bolster Republican candidates, with a total of $66 million spent opposing 23 candidates who ended up losing. That's very interesting. So he helped to defeat probably some pretty good candidates. Probably that $227 million was responsible for the Republican margin, in the House. I mean, remember, they had only a margin of, what was it, something like 222 to 212 to start off with. That's a swing of 5 House seats each way. Probably Mellon accounted for that by himself. The Hybrid PAC has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to support Republican congressional candidates this cycle, including Representative Derek Merrin, Republican Ohio, and Representative Lori Buck, who's a Republican of North Carolina, and over $5 million to oppose Representative Tom Suozzi, who's a Democrat of New York. Wow. That's heavy opposition for Suozzi, who's a reasonably progressive candidate. While the vast majority of Mellon's contributions are directed towards federal elections, he made one state-level contribution of $1 million earlier this year to a group called Fair Courts America in Wisconsin that opposes court packing, and prosecutors they claim have received support from Democratic mega donor George Soros. Quote, Fair Courts America will fight woke judicial activism and defends our courts, unquote, its website reads. Before 2018, Mellon had not made any public federal contributions exceeding $1 million. However, it is possible that he might have given more donations in the past through dark money groups, which would allow him to preserve his anonymity. This article was updated to reflect Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign suspension. So that's an interesting piece. Of course, he's not the only one who's making extremely high contributions. Only the most notable one at this point. But you can be sure there's all kinds of big money coming into this campaign, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. And the billionaires are undoubtedly affecting the positions the people in the campaign are taking on certain issues. One of the most notable of these issues, of course, is Gaza and where people stand, on Gaza. Now, the Democratic contributor, Chaim Saban, has been responsible because he's also a collector. He's an aggregator of donations from all kinds of people. And he's done an enormous amount of aggregation this campaign already for Kamala Harris. And he, of course, has often been quoted as saying he has only one issue, and that, is Israel. He's a one-issue contributor. So there we are. So moving on to our second topic. Hi, Alana. Hi, Steve. See, we have a decent-sized group already here. Thank you all for coming. And thank the silent folks on Twitter. The election is mind-boggling close, so I'm not sure I agree with that, but I will talk to that point a little bit later. So, going to our second topic. The title of this is Labor's Next Big Moment May Finally Be at Hand. Even if the movement isn't rebounding quite yet, green shoots are abounding, and presidential candidates ignore it at their peril. It's written on September 2nd by Timothy Noah. It originally appeared in the New Republic. Timothy Noah, of course, is the comedian, but I guess he's more than a comedian. There's a nice little sign saying, live better with the union. Con union se viva mejor. I hope that pronunciation isn't too far off. My Spanish is nowhere near as good as my French. For my entire adult life, Labor Day has prompted commentators to pronounce the labor movement dead. Occasionally, you'll see somebody argue that organized labor is regaining strength, but the evidence is always anecdotal. Final word must go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics annual report on union membership, which is perennially, relentlessly dismal. Union density, i.e. the percentage of jobs covered by a union contract, is today half of what it was when those, quote, labor is dead, unquote, commentaries started appearing in the early 1980s. That, of course, was after the Reagan defeat of the Aircraft Controllers Union. In the private sector, union density is 6%, down from its historic peak of 34% at the end of World War II. Excepting a tiny bump here or there, union density has tumbled steadily downwards since the 1950s. I will now attempt, says Noah, to make a plausible case for optimism about labor's future. We begin with the assumption that union density, however definitive, is a lagging indicator. Unions won't come back until union density comes back, but maybe something else, some kind of catalyst, has to emerge first. One such catalyst might be popularity. As recently as 2009, unions were unpopular. Gallup showed only 48% approved of them against 45% who disapproved and 7% who had no opinion. No wonder Obama wasn't afraid of the unions. That was an outlier. In most years, labor's approval rated somewhere between 50 and 60%, but after 2009's dismal showing, labor's approval rating started climbing. After Donald Trump was elected president, it climbed into the low 60s. One good thing Donald Trump did, right? And then the high 60s. This year, unions' approval rating is 70%, the highest it's been since the mid-1960s, with the exception of 2022 when it was 71%. People don't just approve of unions, they like them a lot. Even some Republicans, according to Pew, more than 1/3 like labor unions. Among moderate Republicans, more than half view unions favorably. Oh, that's amazing when you consider they're Republicans. And among conservative Republicans, more than 1/4 do. What's the percentage of moderate Republicans, I wonder, in the Republican Party these days? Seems to me they're all running over to the Democratic Party. The news even broke the other day that both Liz Cheney and her father, the veritable Darth Vader of the Republican Party, were both going to vote for Kamala Harris, in this election. Another catalyst or indicator of imminent recovery might be union organizing. A new report by the sociologist Ruth by Milkman and Joseph Vandernoud of City University of New York says organizing is on the rise as well. Petitions to the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, to hold union elections rose after Joe Biden was elected president, especially during the last 3 years, and so did union victories in NLRB elections. Petitions and union victories had both mostly declined during the previous 20 years. CUNY statistics don't include instances in which management recognizes a union voluntarily based on the informal collection of union authorization cards, quote, card checks, unquote. The Center for American Progress claimed last year that voluntary recognition is increasing too, but it offered only anecdotal evidence. According to the CUNY report, voluntary recognitions today represent 8% of all successful union drives. That doesn't seem very many. When a union asks the boss to recognize it, the boss still usually says no. Next, let's consider demographics. Much like the Democratic Party, the labor movement is becoming more amenable to Joe College. Oh. Indeed, the proportion of college grads who belong to a union now exceeds slightly the proportion of high school grads, 9.5% versus 9.2% per CUNY. I'm not sure that is an indicator of the unions coming back. I'd much rather see that 9.5% versus 20.9%. This reflects stepped-up organizing efforts in prestige fields where wages are falling, such as journalism and higher education. Yeah, and over the longer term, the larger role of public employee unions, which scarcely existed before the 1960s. Another likely driver is corporations' growing solicitude since the 1970s toward stockholders at the expense of employees. I don't know whether to count the gentrification of organized labor as a favorable indicator, as Noam Schreiber of the New York Times seems to, or an unfavorable one. It will be a bad thing if it drives a deeper financial wedge between the so-called skilled, i.e. college-educated, and unskilled labor. At the labor union's height, a union card was the financial equivalent of a college degree. If a union card now becomes instead a sort of accessory to a college degree, then the result will be greater economic inequality. I'm glad that Timothy Noah has recognized that particular point and put it so well. But on the other hand, unionization tends to breed more unionization. As more college professors and newspaper reporters vote union, the proletariat may resolve not to be left out. In the 1970s, economists thought labor organizing increased economic inequality. That turned out to be wrong. Let's hope it continues to be wrong. Labor strength has always been, and I believe still remains, a central working class concern. Which brings us to the 2024 election. To become president, a Democrat needs to win a working on the class majority. That's been my mantra. Lately, polls have shown support shifting from Trump to Harris, which is good, but Harris still isn't winning the working class, and that's bad. Okay, as Rui Batesara wrote August 22nd on the Liberal Patriot, quote, Democrats are super happy, working class voters are not, unquote. Tesara cited a Washington Post ABC News Ipsos poll conducted August 9th to 13th that showed Harris leading Trump among all registered voters, 49 to 45%. Of course, that poll is dated by now. But still, polls are showing her with a lead of, I don't know, maybe 3 points. But I think she's still trailing Trump among working class voters, defined as those who lack a college degree, 44% to 51%. Biden lost this group by 2 percentage points in 2020, according to the exit polls. Harris is behind by 7. As with Biden in 2020, the problem appears to be leakage among non-white, mainly Latino, working class voters. In 2020, Biden won non-white working class voters by 46 percentage points, which sounds great until you consider that in 2016, Hillary Clinton won this group by 50 percentage points. Harris, who is non-white, I think that's a good way to describe her, leads among that group by considerably less than even Biden did, 29 percentage points. That's really bad. Look, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Harris can win without a working class majority, just as Biden did in 2020. Biden was the only Democrat to do this going back 100 years. He made himself an exception because he was running against Trump, who was mishandling the COVID pandemic in spectacular fashion. Maybe Harris can repeat Biden's trick. Trump is, after all, the Republican nominee once again. He's no longer botching the government's response to a deadly pandemic, but perhaps his conviction on 34 felony counts, plus his increasingly erratic personal behavior, most recently concerning Arlington National Cemetery will prompt some sort of equivalent revulsion among college educated voters of the sort that gave Biden his crucial boost. Uh, to comment on that, there was an item I haven't had time to watch yet. It was a video, the headline of which was that Biden had that Trump had an insane meltdown in Wisconsin. Uh, the headline, and those are usually overblown, but the headline was basically charging him with an insane outburst. Uh, he's probably feeling the pressure of all kinds of things going on. Anyway, to finish that last paragraph, Harris does a little better with college educated voters than Biden did. Still, I wouldn't count on it because the overwhelming majority of voters are not college graduates. As I noted last week, Harris has a detailed labor platform close to hand in the form of a 2022 report from a task force she chaired on worker organizing. Yet I've never heard Harris even say the words, quote, worker organizing, unquote. It must be her donors don't like those words. Trump has close to hand Project 2025's mandate for leadership, which would, among other things, undermine union contracts, eliminate the voluntary recognition of unions, invite states to opt out of overtime rules, also eliminate child labor protections, and so on. Click here for an overview by the AFL-CIO. That is an overview of Project 2025. If voters start actually believing Trump's claim he knows nothing about Project 2025, there's always Trump's own terrible labor record as president to fall back on. And don't forget Trump telling Elon Musk less than a month ago, quote, you walk in, you say, quote, but you want to quit, unquote. They go on strike. I won't mention, the name of the company, but they go on strike and you say, quote, that's okay, you're all gone, so every one of you is gone, unquote, unquote. Especially today, Harris needs to publicize her strengths and Trump's weaknesses in supporting organized labor. Breezy generalities won't do the job. The New York Times reported last week that Harris's wealthier donors are trying to persuade her not to raise their taxes. Lord only knows what they say when they'll find out she chaired a task force to strengthen and expand union representation. But pledging to build on Joe Biden's pro-labor policies, reciting specifics, is the fastest and best way to reach working-class voters whose support she needs. Things may be looking up for labor, but without a Democrat in the White House, its winning streak won't continue. I agree with that. I also agree that that's a very good thing for Harris to do, to grab hold of that report and clutch it tightly to her breast and expand on what's in it for the working class type. But even more important is what I suggested in my stream a few streams ago, I think last Saturday night. And that suggestion was that she come out for a federal job guarantee at a socially inclusive living wage, averaging $25 per hour across the country, maybe less in some lower cost of living areas, more in higher cost of living areas. If she came out for that, and she talked about it everywhere, that would be the fastest and best way to reach working class voters whose support she needs. That would be the best way, especially in the South, because labor is weak in the South, of course, as it always has been, and people need the money now. Union members need that money now because I think there are quite a few union members here in the United States making less than $25 an hour. So, anyway, I think decisive things do need to be done by Harris to make sure this is not a close election and to get a lot of the working class on her side. I agree with Timothy Noah. Clutching that report tightly is one way to do it, and coming out for the federal job guarantee is another way to do it. So, Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, everybody. Hi, Lana, Evelina D, Steve, thank you all for coming, and all the others whom I can't see because there are 28 of you here, and I can only see about 5 of you. So, Steve says, the election is mind-bogglingly close. That is what the polls are currently showing. But a lot of those polls are Republican polls. And a lot of the videos you're seeing that have those, throwing up the maps and going state by state, a lot of those polls are only looking at the latest poll result in each of the states. And deciding whether to give the state to somebody based on the latest poll result in that state. Since a lot of the latest poll results are coming from Trafalgar, a notoriously biased Republican pollster, quite a few states that might not be coming up in the Republican column are coming up in the Republican column. And some other states showing close races are not perhaps so close as is reported in the Trafalgar polling. I suggest that next week, when some other polls come out, which are more democratic in the way they lean, it may not be quite so close. Steve Wolfbrand says it all comes down to Pennsylvania. I'd be the last one to discount the importance of Pennsylvania in the coming election. It may indeed make the difference between the two parties. There's going to be a huge amount of Democratic money flowing into that election. Not only is it terribly important for Harris to win, but it's terribly important for Democratic congressional candidates to be returned to office and for Democrats to gain ground in Congress as well. We have to remember that Democrats in this election campaign have an enormous amount of money to spend. Kamala has so much money, she's already been dispensing quite a lot of it to congressional candidates. And that money will be put to good use in Pennsylvania. But we have to remember one thing, actually more than one thing, but one thing we have to remember is that Pennsylvania has 19 electoral votes. North Carolina has 16 electoral votes. And the presidential race in North Carolina this year looks closer than it has ever been. And should Kamala lose, in Pennsylvania, she can more than make up for that with victories in Georgia and North Carolina.
What about Virginia?
Well, Virginia is pretty much being considered by people to be a Democratic state these days. It's a mildly Democratic state, but definitely no longer a purple state. And at this point, she's thought to have a 6 or 7 point lead here, in Virginia. It's not a safe state yet, but it's looking pretty good, for Virginia. Steve, didn't the Biden-Harris administration break the railroad workers' strike? It did. But that wasn't, necessarily due to Harris, was it? I mean, she can easily get out of blame for that. A vice president who's running can get out of blame for a lot of things if he or she wants to. But Evelina points out Harris and AOC team are nervous about the Greens. Yes, but they're nervous. I think they're nervous, about a party who's currently garnering about 2% of the vote, on a nationwide basis, and who's campaigning hard for 5%, but who's very unlikely to get there, especially in battleground states. Because the idea that in battleground states you vote for the lesser of two evils, and in safe states you vote for your third party choice, is gaining ground across the country, I think. Steve Wolfbrand says Dick Cheney's endorsement is a kiss of death. Maybe so. Yep, maybe so. That may be a kiss of death. Okay, what I wanted to say about the closeness of the race, though, is that there is an alternative view on that. It's coming from people who are looking at the polls, but they're also looking at things like the voter registration surge that Kamala has been experiencing. They're also looking at the levels of enthusiasm which Democrats are feeling, which evidently right now, and I don't know why, I can't justify this based on my own feelings. I cannot justify it based on rationality. But it seems like the levels of voter enthusiasm for Kamala, based on polling, are beginning to rival the levels of enthusiasm there were for Obama back in 2008. That's not reflected in those polls that just give you, well, this percent went for this and that percent went for that. But polling is an indicator of the current state of the race between two candidates. Levels of enthusiasm for candidates, are a leading indicator of what's going to happen, in the polls. New registration levels are a leading indicator. Small dollar donations are a leading indicator, and those have been enormous for Harris. Those are three leading indicators. Furthermore, Trump is historically underrated in polls. This is true. In 2016 and in 2020, but since 2020, and including in the Republican primaries, Trump has consistently, I shouldn't say just Trump, but the Republican candidates, including Trumpists and Trump himself in the Republican primaries, have underperformed their polls since 2022. Furthermore, of course, the polling organizations have been trying to make adjustments for the overperforming that was characteristic of Trump in 2016 and 2020. So they've been adjusting their samples to account for the overperformance, but they haven't been adjusting their samples to account for the underperformance of the Republicans and the underperformance of Trump, in the primaries. So the point that Trump is historically underrated in polls may be misleading at this point, even though it's certainly true in 2016 and 2020. The enthusiasm in Dem voting registration for Harris rivaling Obama is, quote, because Trump. Don't you know, laugh out loud. It is because of Trump, but it's also because there was tremendous relief among Democratic voters and Democratic would-be voters when the Democrats decided that they were going to ask Joe Biden to leave this race, pressure him, to get out of the race. People were not looking forward to vote for Joe Biden again. And many people were not even looking forward to voting as long as Joe Biden was the candidate. Harris has approached the campaign so far, Harris and Walz, of course, with great vigor, far greater vigor than Trump has shown. For a lot of the time, over the last month and a half, he's been staying away from campaigning. Hasn't been campaigning. But Harris and Walz have been doing rallies everywhere, working really hard. And I saw one of Harris's speeches today. I'm not going to comment on the content because I largely disagree with quite a lot of the content. But the vigor of the speech was notable. I mean, notable. She was laying it right out there. She was strong. And led me to think that we may be looking at a big surprise just a few days from now on September 10th. As we know, youthful, I wouldn't say, isn't she 61? She's certainly 59, so I wouldn't say she's very youthful. But compared to Biden, it's like night and day. So, but I saw a speech Biden was making today, and he seemed to be feeling much more youthful in that speech too. But in Harris's speech, she was extremely forceful. And if she is that way when she debates Trump on Tuesday, I think she's going to roll all over him. But of course, we have to wait and see if and when that happens. I want to call your attention to something else. Let me see if I can easily find it. Yeah, here it is. I'm going to put a video in the for you to see. I'm going to put a link to a video in. It's a video from Simon Rosenberg, who's at hopiumchronicles.com. I know that sounds awfully funny, but he has an interview with Tom Bonnier, and they're looking at the Electoral College, and they take into account not just polling, but alternative data, and other data as well, that Target Smart, has been looking at, and that Tom Bonnier is talking up. That data is about to be released, opened up to the public, to analyze. And it suggests that we may not be looking at a close race at all. So in the comments here, I'm going to leave you with a link to that video, and you can take a look at it for yourself. But I think here, the concept of leading indicators is important. I think the trends in polling are important too, but these other leading indicators suggest things that can really disturb some of the current trends, that we've been seeing. So I want to get to the third of my pieces for tonight. That piece is called, it's on the defending the election topic, and that piece is called Defending a Free and Fair Election. Appeared in the American Prospects by Robert Kuttner. September 3rd, 2024 is the date. Defending a free and fair election, how concerned should we be about tactics to impair voting, and what should be done, to resist? And those are two questions that are asked. And here's a picture of people voting. Voters leave a polling place during primary voting on Tuesday, May 21st, 2024, in Kennesaw, Georgia. There are two broad areas where the Trumpian right will attempt once again to undermine democracy. By the way, I'm not going to talk here. I just have to comment on that first line. Yes, the Trumpian right will attempt to undermine democracy, but in many ways, the Kamalian Center, I'll say Kamalian, I'll coin a term. The Kamalian Center is undermining democracy right now, or at least its Department of Justice is. And the way they're undermining democracy right now is by suppressing free speech in areas they don't like, specifically foreign policy. When it comes to people who are protesting with respect to Gaza, but also when it comes to people who are live streaming contrary opinions about what's going on in Ukraine what's going on in China, what's going on in Russia, and what's going on in Israel, of course, and what's going on in Iran. What they're doing isn't voter suppression, but it does influence votes. It does shut off dissent. It controls the flow of opinion. Going on. The first is voter suppression, where there are echoes of familiar tactics from 2020, including limiting polling places, making vote by mail more arduous, imposing photo ID requirements with double standards. Gun licenses count, for example, student IDs don't. Requiring excessive purges of voter rolls, making it a crime to collect someone's absentee ballot or even to offer a drink of water to a prospective voter waiting in a long line, and giving poll watchers exaggerated rights to challenge or intimidate voters. The second strategy is devising measures to delay vote counts, allowing challenges after votes are cast, and refusing the certification of results. This was the desperate endgame Trump used that culminated in the events of January 6, 2021, and it can occur at both the state and county level as well. Here I have to mention, of course, that Trump has recently admitted that he lost the 2020 election twice. He admitted it twice. And he's getting pushback from places like the Proud Boys and other rightists who supported him. Some folks saying it would have been nice to know that before January 6th. It would have been nice to know that you thought you lost before January 6th. I'm sure some of the people who've gone to jail for January 6th are also not very happy over these admissions of Trump, but they're getting plenty of play, and everybody's going to hear about it. That may be a leading indicator also of what's going to happen in polling. According to the latest report of the Brennan Center, 28 states have added new voter suppression measures since 2020. That's worrisome. But some are trivial, and nearly all are in states that are not key to the presidential outcome. In other words, not much in battleground states. Making it harder to vote and intimidating voters is only one way of subverting democracy, however. The other, and this is the sleeper issue, is messing with the vote count and refusing to certify the result. In key swing states, the government is mostly in the hands of officials who will honor the voters' wishes and provide a rapid count and certification of the winners. But the Republican-controlled counties, where county officials are in charge of election administration, can still do damage. Ground zero of this story is Georgia. There, the state election board, controlled by Trump allies, issued new rules clearly intended to help election deniers fiddle with results. They include a rule that allows county election boards to make, quote, reasonable inquiries, unquote, before certifying an election if they have questions about the outcome or the process. The second rule gives board members the power to, quote, examine all election-related documentation before certifying the results, unquote. The three conservative members of the board held a secret meeting to discuss strategy in violation of state transparency requirements. That prompted ethics complaints. Brad Raffensperger, you remember him from 2020, Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, who in 2020 refused Trump's pressure to find him 11,780 votes, has called the election board a mess and Republican Governor Brian Kemp, who had a superficial kiss and makeup exchange with Trump after Trump ran a losing MAGA primary candidate against him and then insulted him, has now asked the state attorney general for an advisory opinion on whether he can override board rules or fire members. So even Georgia is far from a lost cause for honest voting. By the way, today news broke that court rulings in Montana, in Pennsylvania, and in the third state, I forget which, it might have been in North Carolina, have ruled against some new rules passed by the legislatures. All of these rules, all the election rules involved, would have given Republicans an advantage, okay, in the upcoming election. And the Republicans lost in all three courts. So that's something new that just has happened. It may influence the Montana Senate race with Jon Tester, who I come very close to despising. Is about 6 points behind. And if he loses, that will mean control of the Senate goes over to the Republicans, in which case it's going to be very hard for Democrats, if they win the election, to get any Supreme Court appointees actually passed. And it will also be very difficult, if not impossible, for Democrats to override the filibuster to do what they need to do to bring the current Supreme Court under control, which, as you all know, is a disaster. So this court ruling may help Tester in his run to retain his particular seat. He was, in his last term, just short of being the kind of senators that Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin were. He was far from as bad as they, but he still was bad enough on certain issues, such as raising the minimum wage. Going on with the article, the integrity of the electoral process matters most in the 7 swing states where the election will be decided: Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan, also Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Obviously, it matters in Montana, though, too, because their control of the Senate is probably riding on the Montana election, because Democrats are looking pretty strong in all the other elections. Rather amazingly, they're looking good. Even looking better in Texas right now, where Colin Allred, who's running against Ted Cruz, of course, just got the endorsement of the Cheneys. The Cheneys turned against Ted Cruz. That might help him in Texas. And of course, if that state should flip, to Democrats, then that would compensate for a Montana loss. But the outcome in Montana is very, very important. Anyway, those swing states I just mentioned: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, also Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The good news here is that 5 of the 7 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, have Democratic governors committed to fair elections. Also, Nevada has a Republican governor, but a Democratic Secretary of State and a Democratic Attorney General. One is a Latino and the other is African American. Both passionate defenders of voting rights. And even Georgia, where all the key state officials are Republicans, is not in Trump's pocket. The Republican-controlled Congress, or legislature, in Wisconsin passed several suppression measures, but these were vetoed by the Democratic Governor Tony Evers. In addition, with the flip of the Wisconsin Supreme Court from 4-3 Republican to 43 Democrat, election drop boxes, which had been banned by the previous Supreme Court, are now legal again. This is a local option, and at least 2 heavily Republican areas of the state are not allowing them, but most localities are. And anyway, they probably wouldn't make a big difference in the heavily Republican areas either. But in Nebraska, which allocates electoral votes by congressional district, Democrats hope for a win in the competitive 2nd district, which Biden won in 2020. That, of course, is only 1 electoral vote. Republicans have been trying to change the system to statewide allocation. And the Republican Secretary of State and Attorney General recently shut down implementation of the law allowing people with prior felonies to immediately register to vote, clouding the voting rights of thousands of Nebraskans. 2022, according to the Sentencing Project, a total of 2.2 million Americans in 48 states with prior felony convictions were denied the right to vote. Moreover, while democracy looks relatively secure in 6 of the 7 presidential swing states, the presidency is not all that matters. In the 28 states identified by the Brennan Center as having added new forms of voter suppression since 2020, there are down-ballot battles for control of everything from school boards to legislatures to statewide posts, like governor, attorney general, as well as seats in Congress. There will be close races in Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is running, in Montana, where Jon Tester is running. Also, Nevada, Jackie Rosen is running there for the Democrats. In Maryland, where I think her name is Angela Alsobrooks. I think I've got her first name wrong, a little, but she's pretty outstanding as a candidate, but she's being opposed by Larry Hogan, who's the extremely popular former governor of Maryland. He's a Republican, and he was very popular there, even though the state is highly Democratic. But also Brooks has a lead according to the polling and is a very attractive candidate herself and is expected to win there. But the races are expected to be close. And then, of course, in Michigan, where Elissa Slotkin, she formerly of the CIA, is running for the seat that was vacated by Debbie Stabby now. And so I don't know whether Elissa is going to win, but it will probably be a close race. But she is very competent, as a campaigner, and she's also very smart, even though I don't like the way she votes. But probably she's a good bet to win, in that race. Anyway, the article says those races will determine whether Democrats keep control of the Senate, allowing a President Harris the trifecta she needs to effectively govern, especially bring the Supreme Court under control and the domination of the MAGA Republicans of the Supreme Court. Texas, Colin Allred, is challenging Ted Cruz as a possible pickup if Democratic leading voters are allowed to cast ballots. But Texas is among the worst cases of crude voter suppression. Now, it's been crude, but it's been effective. If a democracy protecting Attorney General or Secretary of State ordered in affected counties to stop fooling around and respect state mandated procedures, uh, uh, then a dispute would end in a state or federal court. If the election is very close and enough Republican controlled counties play enough games in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, it's still possible that certification of the winner could be delayed. David Becker, executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, warns, quote, in a few states like Texas, there appear to be efforts like aggressive investigations very close to an election. It may be intended to make people scared of voting, so they'll self-suppress, unquote. Texas AG, Attorney General Ken Paxton, has created an election integrity unit hoping to intimidate prospective voters who might stay away from the polls, fearing prosecutions for trumped-up violations of some technicality. The unit has just issued multiple search warrants, ostensibly to investigate, quote, fraud and vote harvesting, unquote, in 2022 election after a delay of nearly 2 years. So why have a delay of 2 years? So that they could scare voters in 2024 rather than having resolved those issues before. Despite these suppression efforts, there are several offsetting trends that have strengthened democracy. Becker, who was a senior trial attorney in the Justice Department Civil Rights Division for 7 years, then directed the Pew Polls elections program, points out that nearly everywhere, both registration and voting have never been easier. In 2000, he says only about 40% of Americans lived in states that permitted no excuses early voting. Today, 97% do. By the way, the early voting in many states is going to be a leading indicator of who's going to win. That's one of the things to pay attention to, and early voting is starting soon in many states. Republican efforts to emulate Trump's push to block the final vote count in the Electoral College and toss the election into the House of Representatives will also be blocked by the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022, the one piece of bipartisan reform election to emerge from the January 6th attempted coup. The act makes clear that a state governor or another approved executive, such as Secretary of State, is the sole certifier of which candidate won a state's electoral votes and sets a hard deadline for that certification. It thus heads off 2020-style efforts to create competing slates of electors. It also clarifies that the vice president, in the case of January 6, 2025, Kamala Harris, cannot reject electors and provides a high bar for objections to the electoral count. Rick Hasen, a UCLA law professor who heads the Safeguarding Democracy Project and writes an election law blog, notes that in 2020, the courts rejected one frivolous Republican lawsuit after another. So far in 2024, Republican bids to use litigation to disqualify likely Democratic voters have not found sympathetic judges. Justin Levitt, a leading constitutional scholar of voting rights, agrees in virtually all of the cases of attempted delay and frivolous challenges that have landed in court. Levitt says, quote, Courts, whether state or federal or Republican or Democrat, have acted like courts and have enforced the election law, unquote. Of course, the Supreme Court will no doubtly be an exception. For instance, the North Carolina legislature has passed legislation taking away from the governor the power to appoint key state election officials. So far, that move has been blocked by state courts in North Carolina. Levitt, who served as President Biden's senior policy advisor for voting rights, now teaches law at Loyola Marymount University, adds that 2020 was also more of a problem because COVID and the voting remedies for lockdowns added to delay and uncertainty. That will not be a factor in 2024. And Levitt makes another often overlooked point. The conventional wisdom in political science and campaign circles has been that low propensity voters tend to vote for Democrats when they bother to vote. But Trump, both in 2016 and 2020, also rallied a lot of low turnout voters. In many states, says Levitt, Republicans now support reducing barriers to voting. Quote, the GOP now likes vote by mail, unquote, he says. Yet not quite all the news is good. Racially targeted voter suppression remains a threat. Congress has not passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act or the Freedom to Vote Act, which, among other things, would restore the protections of the original Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was shamefully gutted by the Roberts Court in 2013 in Shelburne County versus Holder. So there's still plenty of room for racially targeted anti-democratic mischief, if that's what you call it. I call it criminal. I call it crimes. But anyway, as noted, the serious soft spot in the game since 2020 is the potential role of deep red counties. Such counties typically control voting procedures. County level officials could attempt a variety of tricks of the sort proposed at the state level by the Georgia State Election Board to delay certification of results. Even more ominous is the threat of violence directed at election workers aimed at delaying the count. Trump and his allies have already said that there is no way that he can lose a fair election. If on election night he appears to be losing, he will put out the word that the election was rigged. That in turn will activate armies of his most extreme supporters who have already been primed to conduct vigilante actions. Quote, well, I'm not so concerned that the loser will be installed in office, unquote, says Becker. Quote, I am very concerned that lies about the election by the loser could incite violence, particularly against election officials all over the country, particularly in deeply red counties, unquote. On balance, electoral democracy is far better defended than in 2020. Quote, major credit belongs to the legal teams and grassroots organizations that have fought voter suppression for years, unquote. Says Miles Rappaport, who leads the 100% Democracy Project and is a board member of the American Prospect, from which I'm reading this article. Quote, but Trump and his enablers are constantly inventing new tactics, so the fight to protect the integrity of the November election will by no means be easy. What else can citizens do? Becker points out that in nearly every state, in-person early votes are scanned and tallied before election nights and then become part of the official total right after the polls close. The more of these votes there are, the less overworked local election officials are, and the less vulnerable they are to vigilante harassment. The best remedy is for voting rights activists and litigators to be vigilant, for citizens to vote early, and for the Democrats to win by a landslide well beyond the margin of theft. And I couldn't agree more with that last. The best remedy is for voting rights activists and litigators to be vigilant, for citizens to vote early, as we will, and for the Democrats to win by a landslide well beyond the margin, of theft. Of course, that last assumes that we don't have a third party, that has a chance, to win. I think that's the situation right now, unless there's some miracle of American democracy. I don't think that Jill Stein or Claudia de la Cruz or Cornel West are going to be factors, in this election. So if we assume that is not the case, then it would be better for the Democrats to win by a landslide, which is well beyond the margin of theft. So I will now turn to your comments. I expect these to be very vigorous at this point. Steve Wolfbrand said Trump will win, in my opinion. Well, you're, as always, entitled to your opinion, Steve. Oh, by the way, if you could do like, share, and subscribe here, it would be very, very good, everybody, because I have a pretty goodly number of people here. Over the last 2 weeks or so, my attendance has gotten a lot better, and that's true for this stream also. But my indicators of like are not very high on the StreamYard interface. Steve says Harris cannot perform without the teleprompter. Well, I don't know about that. I'll tell you why. She's been campaigning all over the country and vigorously. And more, her pronouncements seem to be really authentic and sure of themselves. When you campaign a lot, you get sure, of your message. You get sure of your talking points. Your memory gets better. And I believe she can perform without, the teleprompter. I believe she will do so during the debate on Tuesday. Evelina says, I think Trump is fueling a lot of the Dem voter registration enthusiasm. If it wasn't for fear of another Trump administration, Harris would not be leading. Well, of course, unless they were running another candidate, there would be fear of another Trump administration. So yes, I think Harris's lead, is attributable to that. But if the Republicans had been running someone else, Harris might not be leading. But remember, the polls had been showing for months that a generic Democrat was going to beat, a generic Republican. So the Democrats do still have a lead in voter popularity across the country. So I'm not sure Harris would not be leading. It would have been an interesting race if, Harris were running, against, say, I don't know, Vivek Ramaswamy or somebody like that. And that might have been, an interesting race. But generally speaking, the Republicans had a bunch of wild candidates up there. A moderate Republican with the center right Harris would have made for a more interesting election. Uh, yes, I agree, but the Republicans weren't about to nominate Liz Cheney. She would have been a tough candidate for Harris. But of course, they kicked her out of the party. I think they kicked all their good candidates out of the party. I mean, okay, I think if Ron DeSantis were running and we had Project 2025, I think Harris would be doing just as well or better against him than she's doing against Trump. So, Evelyn has said to mobilize non-voters. Third parties may decide to rally behind the Greens. That would be the smart thing to do. Would be the smart thing to do, but I still don't think they're going to get the 5%. They might get the 5% in states that are not really battleground states. But if they united behind the Greens, then the Greens would get the 5%, and the Libertarians might not be too happy about that. Steve says, I got to bounce. Good night, everyone. Good night, Steve, and thank you for coming. Okay, and I think that about does it for the comments. And that about does it for the articles. And I think that about does it for me as well. I think it's time for me to say goodnight. Dawn Foster said, Florida's too red. Only Pinellas County is Democratic for the most part. Are you saying Dade County is not a Democratic county still? I mean, I'm sure Miami-Dade is still blue. Anyway, though, recent polling has been showing the Democrats are only something like 4 points behind in Florida. And they are also relatively close in Texas as well. Now, of course, the same thing happened in 2020. And the Republicans came out on strong and won big in both of those states. But it remains to be seen whether that's going to be the case in 2024 because of the voter registration surge, which we were seeing in both Texas and Florida, where a lot of Democratic non-voters suddenly registered. The registration figures for black women voters have come close to tripling. That's really something. And Colin Allred in Texas is running strong against Cruz, which is also rather amazing. So I don't know how this is going to work out. I do know that Democrats have raised so much money that they're considering making runs for it in Texas and Florida. If they're successful in either state, it's going to break things for Harris. if they could win in Texas, of course, there are 40 electoral votes in Texas. If I'm not mistaken, there are 30 electoral votes in Florida. Either state, if they break for the Democrats, mean it's no longer close. And that's true even if Trump were to win in Pennsylvania, which I don't think he's going to win. I have this feeling with all the Democratic enthusiasm in Pennsylvania, with Shapiro, who's a popular governor, campaigning all over the state for the tickets, with the popular Congress people, which the Democrats now have in Pennsylvania, campaigning in their districts, with Bob Casey running for the Senate again. I don't think the Republicans are going to take Pennsylvania. I'm sorry. I think the Democrats have got Pennsylvania again. So I'm reasonably confident that Trump's not going to win Pennsylvania. Now, I know that a huge amount of Republican money is pouring into Pennsylvania. But I also know that just as much Democratic money is pouring into Pennsylvania. And I know the Republicans don't have that much money yet. So the money they're pouring into Pennsylvania, they're not pouring into Michigan or Wisconsin or North Carolina. And remember what I said. Even if they win Pennsylvania, if the Democrats win in North Carolina, that's only 3 extra electoral votes for them. Evelyn says, I see a civil war looming, too much damned discontent. Not if there's a landslide victory for the Democrats. Then people will wait to see what Harris will do. Whether she can do things, whether she can do big things, is going to depend on whether she controls both the House, and the Senate. She needs the trifecta, and she needs to be aggressive, and the Democrats need to be aggressive. However small the majority in the Senate, they have to get rid of the filibuster, and they have to pass bills like crazy. In the first 100 days, they have to disarm the Supreme Court completely. They have to pack it. They have to pass a whole raft of bills that neutralize all of the decisions that have been made by the Supreme Court since 2010, including the Citizens United decision. All of them have to be voided. No more super PACs. Of course, others that have to be voided are the Dobbs decision, the Loper-Bright decision, the Shelby County versus Holder decision.
Women's rights.
And women's rights, of course. But now that's a question for more ratification from the states to pass the amendment, the constitutional amendment. But the voiding of the Dobbs decision will take care of abortion rights, for women. Oh, and also the Trump versus the United States decision, perhaps most important of all. In other words, the decision giving the president immunity from criminal prosecution. That is a travesty, and that is unconstitutional. Anybody who reads the Constitution can see that is unconstitutional. That is one decision of the Supreme Court that is absolutely full of shit. Of course, there have been a number of them. But that one stands out It's right up there with Dred Scott. On that note, I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you all for coming. Attendance was pretty good here today. According to the indicator on my interface, there are 43 people here. That's very good for this particular stream. I will next see you on Tuesday, when I'll probably be back with another international relations show. Thank you all for coming. Good night, everyone. Good night, Dee.